Okay, so I'm going to be talking about multiplication. So I've been working on multiplications for a long time. My master's degree, PhD degree, they are all based on large integer arithmetic. Then for most of my professional life, I worked on public key crypto, RSA, ECC, and fully homomorphic encryption, which included a million-bit multiplier, million-bit integer multiplier, and then, again, fully homomorphic encryption, including lattice-based crypto-based applications, including multiplication of large polynomials. So when this problem was introduced to me, I was ready to go. But this was a new, this problem introduced a new constraint, which is lowest latency possible for a single modular multiplication. Before, I was always focused on throughput optimizations for multipliers, but this time latency was the most important aspect, so I had to do something new. So first, outline of the presentation. First, I'm going to talk about large integer arithmetic. There's some examples of algorithms. See, there's more multiplication algorithms, more reduction algorithms in literature, but these are the ones that I have experience with. So that I'm just going to share my experience with this stuff. Maybe there's some stuff better out there, but in literature, etc. Yeah, I know those. I read those stuff, but these are the ones that I have experience with. So then I'm going to talk about some CPU improvements that sped up large integer arithmetic, and I'm going to talk about the low latency algorithm that we constructed for VDFs, for fixed modules. So first, let's start with basics, schoolbook multiplication. It's very simple. You just represent a number using digits, and you just multiply the digits, and you accumulate the results on top of each other. So the orange part that you see, we can do the accumulation using adder trees, but eventually, yeah, you can do redundant representation, but eventually you need to propagate all the carries all the way through. So that constitutes a problem for low latency applications, because when you accumulate the carries, so imagine that this is a 2K bit number. That's what we need. So you have to propagate the carries across these 2K bits, which is a huge delay. Yes, you can use carry looker adders, etc., special adders, but they are very large in area, and they consume a lot of power. So this is just to show the inherent problem inside large integer multiplication, the carry problem. So Karasuma multiplication is a high-level optimization method that's basically reducing the number of core multiplications required to realize a large integer multiplication. So here in this picture, there's two integers a and b. Instead of multiplying a and b, instead of doing 4 multiplications, with Karasuma approach, you can just do 3 core multiplications, a1, b1, a0, b0, and a1 plus a0 times b1 plus b0. And in the middle, you just subtract a1, b1 here, and a0, b0 here, and you get a times b. Again, yes, this reduces number of multiplications, increases number of additions. Maybe for large arithmetic, at some point, this gets better than classical multiplication, but eventually, in the end, you have to propagate carries again. So you have the same problem with this one. So yes, it's better for throughput-based applications, but it's not good for low latency multiplication. Yes, there's NTT-based multiplications. These also reduce the number of core multiplication operations that you need to do for very large numbers. So what we do is first, we represent each integer using, let's say, vectors. You take NTT of the vectors, compute NTT of the digits with respect to the base of A and B, multiply the NTT results component by component, and then you do inverse NTT, and then you accumulate the carries. I'm not going to get into details. I just want to show you that these are out there. We worked on this stuff. This is from a paper that we wrote about million-bit multiplier. But the problem with this is it's still inherently sequential, this algorithm. So what's happening inside here is that you see there's 3 inner for loops. So for this inside loop, we designed this NTT unit. So in this NTT unit, in the critical path, there's a modular subtractor, modular multiplier, and in the end, modular reduction. And so we go back. This happens from 0. Yeah, I'll get into the details of how many times it happens, but for example, for a 256-digit number, this happens 8 times, log 2 to the 256. It happens 8 times for NTT, 8 times for inverse NTT, and once there's one single multiplier in the critical path for component-wise multiplication. So again, this is inherently sequential. This is just showing an example construction for NTT-based multiplication of integers. Yes? Number theoretic transform. So there's FFT-based multiplication. So if you look at this picture, this is like a triangle. So this looks very much like a convolution. So you can apply FFT on this and do the additions very quickly. But with FFT, you lose precision. We cannot lose precision for cryptographic applications. We cannot even lose a single bit. So instead of that, we use number theoretic transform, which is based on FFT, but you don't lose precision. So this is an example construction. In the end, if you look at the numbers here, if you do a classic schoolbook multiplication using 16-bit multiplications, you need to do 128 by 128 multiplications. But with this approach, you need to do 128 times 15 40-bit modular multiplications. For larger numbers, the advantage shifts from one to another. But this is just to show you that NTT-based multiplication changes number of multiplications, but it is still inherently sequential. So I couldn't use it for this application. So this was just multiplication. Now, we also need to do reduction after multiplication. So there's 2 major algorithms that we use for reduction. One is Montgomery reduction. So the goal for Montgomery reduction is get a 2k-bit number, reduce it to a k-bit number. This picture is showing overall what's happened, the goal of Montgomery reduction. There is a lot of different implementations, word level, bit level, again here, the entire integer level, let's say. But this is just showing you what's happening in the end of Montgomery reduction. So you need a Montgomery constant. So you have your number, 2k-bit number. You get the low part of that 2k-bit number, multiply it with a constant. You get the low part of that result, multiply with the modulus. You add it to the original number. And in the end, the bottom k-bits become 0. And you're left with a k-bit result. And the result is actually c times r to the minus 1 modulo m, where r is 2 to the k. But this is really good for repeated multiply settings, exponentiation settings. But Montgomery reduction here, in the critical path, there is 2 large multiplications on top of the original multiplication that produced this result. So there's Barrett reduction. It's doing the same thing, but this time from top to bottom. Again, you get your 2k-bit number. You get the high part. You multiply with Barrett constant. You get the high part of the result. Multiply with modulus. But this time you subtract it from the result of the multiplication. And now the top k-bits are 0. And you end up with a k-bit result. But again, in the critical path, you have 2 large multiplications. Yes, this one, the first one, is a little simpler than this one because, see, you only need the high part of the result. You don't need the entire result. And in Montgomery, you only need the low part of result. You don't need the high part of result. So this first multiplication is a little simpler than the other ones, but still, in the critical path, for the entire modular multiplication, if you use Montgomery or Barrett, you have almost 3 multiplications, 3 large multiplications. So this is just giving you introducing you the problem inherent inside the modular multiplication for low latency applications. So CPU improvements. What did we do at Intel? So we introduced MOLX, HCX, ADOX instructions. to speed up large integer arithmetic. This is just showing you how you multiply a and b. So you have entire a, you first multiply it with the digit of b, and then the next digit of b, so b0, b1, b2, and b3, and then you accumulate all of them into this result. See, on a CPU, the basic core multiplier is a 64-bit multiplier, so these could be 64-bit digits. So you could be just multiplying them together and then accumulating. So this is a more detailed explanation of what's happening there. Let's say you're done with a times b0. Now on top of that, you need to accumulate a times b1. So you need to multiply each digit of a with b1 and accumulate them in place like this. So what's happening here is that the result of each core multiplication is actually 128-bit number. And the CPU has a 64-bit ALU. It cannot do 128-bit additions. So what we do is there's two options here. You either add this one using an add instruction on top of this, and add this one on top of this one with the add carry instruction. And then you have a carry in the carry flag. You have to dump it onto this one. Do the same thing with this one. Add carry, and add carry with 0. Add carry with 0, and add carry with 0. Or what you can do is you can add the low part of this and save the high part. Add carry low part, save the high part. Add carry low part, save the high part, and add carry low part, and save the high part. Go back to add carry again. Well, these could all happen in parallel somehow, but the problem is inside the CPU, there's only a single carry flag. There's only a single flag that can hold the carries. So when you add these two 64-bit numbers, you end up with a 65-bit number that the extra bit goes to a flag, and that needs to be consumed before we can move on to the other operations. See, there is two carry chains that can run in parallel here, but there's only a single carry flag. So this happens, again, this is, for the CPU implementations, this is inherently sequential, although it's not algorithmically inherently sequential. So what we did is came up with new instructions. Add CX and add OX, for example. So what add CX is doing is it's adding two integers with the carry flag and putting the result, the top bit, again, to a carry flag. How it's different with add carry is that it's not touching the overflow flag. And this instruction, add OX instruction, there is, it's adding two integers, 64-bit numbers, with the overflow flag as the carry flag. And it's accumulating the result onto the overflow flag. So with this approach, now we have two carry flags. With those two carry flags, now these carry chains can happen in parallel, which increase the performance of multiplication a lot. So the CPU was not, before these instructions, before all of the CPU was not suitable for actually large integer arithmetic, but these ones sped up the CPU for large integer arithmetic. There's more improvements, there's AVX instructions, etc., but I just want to move on because I talked enough about the carry problems. So now the algorithm and the construction that we did. I worked with polynomial multiplications, so I decided to just start with, represent an integer using a polynomial, because you only accumulate the results on the coefficients. So just for a level of abstraction, I'm representing each number as a polynomial. So there's a redundant representation. The redundancy is each coefficient of the polynomial has an extra bit. This adds a redundancy. And I'm going to explain why. And there's an extra coefficient for each polynomial. Again, I'm going to explain why there is the extra coefficient. This algorithm is not a complete modular reduction algorithm. This algorithm is only suitable for repeated multiply settings, exponentiation, VDF, time lock puzzle. So it's an incomplete reduction. Yeah, it's good for exponentiation. So to simplify the explanation, I just want to show an example construction. Coefficient length for this construction is 16 bits. It could be any bits, but just for this example, I'm representing each coefficient using 16 bits, and I'm just going to multiply two 64-bit integers using this representation. And so integers a and b are represented using two polynomials where the coefficients have the weight of 16 bits. So this is integer a, integer b, 4 digits, 4 coefficients. I'm just going to multiply these two integers. So just the beginning, this is what happens when you do multiply two polynomials. So you have 16-bit inputs. You do coefficient-wise multiplication. These multiplications can happen all at the same time. These core multiplications, A0, B0 to A3, B3, the orange part, they can happen all at the same time. So you can put as many multipliers as you can in a hardware implementation and just realize this very fast. And then the accumulation happens only coefficient-wise. And this could be an adder tree for each one of them. But the problem is, see, when we do this, the carry does not propagate to the next coefficient. So the carry propagation is limited only inside the coefficient. So instead of a 2k-bit carry propagation, now we have about 32-bit carry propagation. But the problem is, we started with a 16-bit number, 16-bit coefficient, but now each coefficient is 34 bits. So, and if we continue multiplying this, the coefficients are going to increase and increase in size, so which is not good. So now, what I did is, OK, so I split each coefficient into two parts. So the orange part is the lower 16 bits of the coefficients of the triangle that you see here, the orange triangle you see here. And the green part are the higher bits of them. So each coefficient has 16-bit degree, so I can accumulate the higher parts of each coefficient with the next coefficient. So now I have an adder tree that's looking like this at the top, with the orange and green ones. So again, we can use an adder tree to accumulate these intermediate results. In the end, we end up with, this time, 19 bits, which is much smaller than the 36 bits. And then what we can do is we can propagate carries here to drop to 17 bits, not 16 bits. If we want to drop to 16 bits, then we have to, again, propagate all the carries across all the coefficients, which creates a 2k-bit carry chain. So we stop at 17 bits. So the carry only propagates from one coefficient to another. So the carry propagation only happens, for this example, only happens for 32 bits. So the problem is, again, well, we started with a 16-bit coefficient. Now we have 17-bit coefficients. Well, again, if we continue like this, it's going to grow. So what we do is, well, OK, we accept 17 bits as the final answer. Now our coefficients in our redundant representation, the coefficients are 17 bits instead of 16 bits. So again, now let's start with 17 bits. Let's multiply two polynomials with 17-bit coefficients. So now the results, intermediate results, are 34 bits instead of 32. Again, now this time, if we accumulate, well, intermediate results are going to end up 36 bits for this example. Now, I split the coefficients into three parts: lower 16, higher 16, and the highest 2 bits, because they're now 34 bits. They're not 32 anymore. And the weights of the coefficients are 16 bits each. So I split them up like this. And again, I use an adder tree using carry save adders to Wallace tree, whatever is available, to accumulate them. And in the end, again, I end up with 17-bit coefficients. I started with 17 bits. I ended up with 17 bits. So multiplication part is fine. Now, reduction. I need to do reduction modulo m. So because this is an algorithm that's designed for a repeated multiplication setting, exponentiation, I can do incomplete reduction. I don't need to reduce it all the way. I don't need to get rid of the redundant representation to the integer representation. I can just continue with the, I can just stay at the redundant representation. Montgomery or Barrett can be utilized, but in the critical path, there is total of almost 3 large multiplications in critical path. So I decided to use a different approach that drops the number of operations in the critical path. So reduction modulo m, how that happens is that, see, each coefficient has a weight. And each coefficient modulo m can be pre-computed and be saved in lookup tables. If you look at this, for example, the topmost coefficient, d8, has the weight of 2 to the 16 plus 16 times 4. Sorry, it's 2 to the 64 plus 16 times 4. So pre-compute all the values from 0 to 2 to the 17 minus 1 for this one, put them in this lookup table, and just get this as input, address input to this lookup table, and get the result, and accumulate on top of this 4 coefficients. These are all 16-bit numbers because they are pre-computed. They don't have to be 17 bits. They are not in redundant representation. They can be 16 bits. So, and this is the other example. So we have these 7. So now the weight of this one is 2 to the 64 plus 16 times 3 instead of 16 times 4. And pre-compute all the 2 to the 7 is 128, all the 128K entries, and put it here. So this is just showing you the idea. This is not practical. Having a 17-bit read address lookup table is not practical to implement in hardware. So what I did is, well, I split up the coefficients into 2. So now each coefficient, so the bottom 8 bits of this coefficient can go to this 8-bit address lookup table. Top 9 bits can go to this 9 read address bit lookup table. So this includes all the pre-computed values of the same weight. But the only difference between this one and this one is, see, there's a plus 8 here, because this has weight plus 8. So you see, this has 2 to the 64 plus 16 times 4, but there's extra 8 bits here. So we need to have this extra 8 bits. So these are different lookup tables. And they can be accumulated here. But now this is practical. 8-bit address, read-write address for a lookup table. Sorry, 8-bit read address for a lookup table is practical. And we targeted an FPGA implementation for this. So in FPGAs, there are these tiny building blocks called block RAMs. They have 9-bit read address, read-write address. So they could be utilized to implement these lookup tables. So you can see, this is just an example. You can go lower. You can go to you can go to 4-bit address. You can go to 2-bit address. Different implementations. This is just one of the ideas that's possible. And of course, there's a lot of different implementations, but this is just to show you the idea. So for this example, this is the final picture for reduction. Well, close to final. Each coefficient goes through its own lookup table. These lookup tables are unique for all of them. They're all different because each coefficient has different weights. So they also all need to be pre-computed and stored inside the FPGA or ASIC, hardware, wherever you want to do this implementation. So, and they're all accumulated here. See, these accumulations, again, are coefficient-wise accumulations. And they can be done using the same adder tree that we constructed before. And in the end, we still end up with 17 bits. The problem with this is, well, yes, we started with 17 bits. We end up with 17 bits. But we have an extra coefficient here that we need to get rid of, because we started with 4 coefficients. For the repeated multiply setting, we have to end up where we start. We can reduce this after this, so you can easily use the same lookup table, these two, and reduce this, but it is sequential. It adds another layer of reduction in the critical path. Instead of that, I said, OK, let's just leave it as it is. Let's add an extra coefficient to the redundant representation. So, and finish here. So next time we start the multiplication, now instead of 4, we have a +1 coefficient. That +1 coefficient increased the depth of this adder tree only 1. And that's OK. It doesn't add much to the critical path. And yeah, we end up with 37 bits, etc. But this is the final picture for reduction. See, I only added 2 coefficients. So imagine this is a 2k-bit number. For a 2k-bit number, if you're using 16-bit coefficients, you have 128 coefficients. Instead of 128 here and 256 lookup tables, you have 130, which is really small compared to adding another level of reduction in the critical path. So again, you can do this. You can add these up all using adder tree, which has supposedly have log n depth, log n circuit depth, and propagate the carries only 32 bits and end up with 17 bits. So we started with 5 17-bit coefficients. We end up with 5 17-bit coefficients. And now we can go and do the next multiplication. So this is it. This is done. So conversion from redundant polynomial representation to integer representation is very simple. You just add up the coefficients in the end. It has to be done only once when you're done with the multiplication or squaring operation. When you want to get the actual result modulo m, when you need to complete the reduction. But this is incomplete reduction. We're not done, but we are in a redundant representation. So this is really good for repeated multiply settings. So this is the critical path. We have, in the critical path, we have a single core multiplier, regardless of the length. 2k bits, 4k bits, 8k bits. In the critical path, we only have a single core multiplication. And for this example, core multiplication is 17 bits, 17 by 17. Well, it could go down to 8, 4, 1, whatever you want. And we have an adder tree. Adder tree, as far as I know, has log n circuit depth, close to log n circuit depth. We have a 2D bit carry propagation. D is the coefficient length, and this example, it's 17 for this example construction. A lookup table, whatever you see in this, again, in this example, the lookup table has the worst case 9-bit read address. So that's added. But it's, again, it's a constant delay. You go from 1K to 2K to 4K. That delay doesn't change. You have an adder tree, and you have 2D-bit carry propagation. So when you increase the size, the only depth that changes is these adder trees. The others, they stay constant. So performance results, we did a proof of concept implementation using FPGA, the Xilinx VCU118 board, close to 400,000 lookup tables. Well, this lookup table is not the one that I was talking about. Lookup table is a 6-to-1 lookup table inside the FPGA. These are the building blocks of the FPGA. There are the DSP slices inside the FPGA, which has 48-bit multiply accumulate units. We're not using the multiply accumulate. We're only using the multiplier, the 18 by 25 signed multiplier to do a 17 by 17 unsigned multiplication operation. It has BRAMs, which has 9-bit read-write address RAM blocks with a single clock read latency. That's what we need. We need a single clock read latency for the big lookup tables that we produced. So in the end, we achieved close to 7 nanosecond clock periods with a 9 clock cycle pipeline, totaling to 66 nanoseconds per 2k-bit square operation. So yeah, this is it. Yes?
Can you break down the 66 nanoseconds a bit more on this chart? I didn't quite understand. Maybe you said it, but I didn't follow. On the previous chart, we got how much of the latency, the 66 nanoseconds, goes to each of these components?
Most of them go to these adder trees. Yes. See, I cannot answer that because in the FPGA implementation, see, this is suitable for ASIC implementation. This is showing you everything. If you have enough hardware in the FPGA, we don't have enough hardware to realize all of these things, to put all of these things. So we had to divide this into 4, for example. Dividing it into 4, we have 9 clock cycles. One of the clock cycle goes to, for example, this adder tree, this part, this orange part. One clock cycle goes to this part. So, and they're all close to 7 nanoseconds. And again, this was, so for example, this part on the FPGA is a single clock cycle. So different levels, different pipelining levels, each of them is about 7 nanoseconds. Yes?
So what's the max clock frequency on the FPGA then?
As far as I remember, it's about 500 megahertz. I'm sorry?
You have a lot of room to spare at 7 nanoseconds now.
Yes, but there's a lot of things in the critical path. So, and we only care about latency. We don't care about throughput. So we didn't want to go and pipeline it anymore to get. So you get to 500 megahertz, but you increase the number of clock cycles to achieve this. And you cannot start the next problem before you finish the first problem. So this was kind of close to the optimal solution that we had. So in the FPGA, for example, this orange part, it has 66 inputs, 66 to 2 compressor unit using carry save adders, using a Wallace tree. So that by itself has a 7 nanosecond delay. Any questions? Okay. Yes?
You said using 17 bits lookup table would be not readable. Like how much RAM would be necessary to have 7 bits lookup table, and how fast would that speed of the computation if it was possible?
So if it's 17 bits, the read address is 17 bits. So the depth of the decoder for the address is log n. So you need 5 levels, 4 to 5. Let's say go down to 16, you need 4 levels at least. So if you go down to 17, it's a 5 gates in the critical path, and it's huge. So when it becomes huge, there is a lot of wiring delays, other stuff, the power concerns, etc. So it becomes also expensive to produce. But with this, when you split it up into 2, you reduce the area a lot, you decrease the number of gates in the critical path, and you decrease the power. But by just doubling you just double your adder tree. Right? Doubling the adder tree only adds a full adder in the critical path. Yes?
What do you think that, what paths do you think that can be improved from now on? Because there will be a competition and people will try to look for things to improve. What do you think people should look into?
One thing is this part, this compression. So here, let's say you're doing a 2K-bit squaring. Then let's say you ended up using 16-bit coefficients. See, that's one thing, deciding the length of the coefficients. 17 fits really well for us because in the FPGA, there's an 18 by 25 multiplier. So we could use a 17 by 17. But this could drop to 8 bits and do the 9-bit coefficients, drop to 4 bits, 5-bit coefficients, different levels. So if it's let's say you pick 16 bits coefficients. So for a 2K bit, you have 128 coefficients. 128 coefficients means you have to add up 256 numbers. You need a 256 to 2 compressor. So that needs to be improved for area, for critical path, for power, etc. So and that's one thing. Another thing is the multiplication part, for example. Same accumulator is being used in this multiplication part, but with different, let's say, weights. See, you have this in the real part. Yeah, you have these 2 bits extra that needs that. So you're adding 7 16-bit numbers together and 3 2-bit numbers together. It scales up. So this part also needs to be improved. So yeah, see, the main part that needs to be improved is the compressor, I believe. And again, sorry, size of the lookup tables. See, I picked 8 and 9 bits in this example, but again, maybe it's more beneficial to use 4 bits, 4, 4, 4, 5, or maybe more beneficial to not use any lookup tables, do a bitwise, and that increases this length to 2K. So those all need to be explored. Any questions? Okay.